Hey guys, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be a video on promotion watch lists for players who have actually come up from the Championship 22-23 promoted teams who are now in the Premier League 23-24 season. That's going to be players from Burnley, Luton Town and Sheffield United. I'm going to start with the forward positions, the midfield position, just because I don't think that some of the players from these teams have been talked about very much. We, of course, have looked into the budget defenders in the 4.0 sort of price category, but I think I have some more to say on the defenders later, so do stay tuned for that and how I evaluate some previous championship defenses, something that I mentioned in the defenders cheat sheet video. As far as the fixtures to actually get started with, one of the most concerning things for me off the bat is that Burnley actually have one of the worst fixture runs, even though they're the team that actually finished in first place and actually are expected to stay and maybe stave off relegation based on betting odds that I've seen so far. So Burnley have, unfortunately, 6 red fixtures, as you can see based on this sort of FDR ranking that I've made myself. Unfortunately, because they have so many tough games, I think there's no real reason to invest into a Burnley player unless you're looking into someone who covers specifically in game weeks 2 and 5, or you're just looking for a 4.0 defender that has less ownership than the rest. Because at this point in time, we have Bell, who actually has the highest ownership in terms of 4.0 defenders. So for that reason, maybe you'd like to invest into a Burnley one, just to actually make sure that someone like Bayer from Burnley wouldn't be subject to a price fall early doors. However, I have also illustrated some fixture runs and some fixture pairs too to actually think about. So with Luton Town, what's interesting is that you can see that Everton and Luton have really good rotation. So you could actually look at going for a defensive rotational pair with Everton and Luton. As you can see, you're probably getting around 6 green fixtures, 1 white fixture, and then 1 red fixture in game week 5. But you could also arguably say that Luton versus Fulham away, depending on how strong you think Luton is, could be a white fixture. For now, of course, as I said, this is an interesting pair because Everton defenders could be really cheap. Right now, you can have access to their defenders and centre backs at 4.5. You also have access to Luton defense at 4.0. So if Branthwaite from Everton, who actually is a 4.0 defender coming back on loan from PSV, actually finds his way towards the starting team for the Sean Dyche team by game week 1, you could actually have an incredible rotational pair of defenders if you really wanted to kind of skim the budget on your bench. So that would be comprised of 8.0 million, but that's only subject to Branthwaite actually being a starter. Otherwise, of course, 8.5 is more than decent if you want to actually capitalize on this sort of rotational pair. As far as Burnley, we said that their fixtures are tough, but I think looking at Sheffield United, this isn't necessarily a fixture pair or an opportunity here, but I do think that there is an option to maybe, let's say, start the season with someone like a 4.5 Sheffield United defender, and I will talk about one of the options that actually fits that category later. But because Sheffield United actually have 3 out of 4 good fixtures between game weeks 1 and game week 4, and Newcastle actually have horrific fixtures, you could, of course, think about going for, let's say, a Sheffield United defender and then move quickly towards a Newcastle defender at 4.5 in Botman. So that could be a very interesting transfer relationship that you can think about. And of course, if Sheffield United seem to be performing well, maybe you actually keep that defender as well, or you just downgrade as well if there are some more appealing 4.0 options at that time. But of course, as I said, if you start with someone like 4.5 from Sheffield, then you could also move towards a Newcastle player there. At the same time, there's going to be an opportunity to look at forwards too. So between Everton and Luton, you could actually say that moving between, let's say, Morris and DCL could be interesting. And of course, if we move towards the forwards now, starting off things, I just mentioned him, but it's going to be Carlton Morris that I think is the clear standout option out of all promoted teams. And that's simply because he's the talisman of this Luton team. He's on penalties based on my expectations. Looking back at Luton last season and also in previous years past, the actual penalty taker was Adebayo, but now that Morris actually took the most recent penalty from Luton, and based on some Luton fan expectations, we can conceivably say that I think Morris will take the next penalty just based on history. So Morris being the penalty taker at 5.5, him actually having very, very good numbers from expected goals and expected assists is something good to see. Now, of course, one thing that we have to be aware of is that you're going to struggle in the Premier League, especially as a promoted team, and potentially the ability to actually create as many effective chances is going to be much tougher in the Premier League. But one thing that you must say is that there are no other options really within Premier League teams outside of maybe Kalamjik from Wolves that could actually be, let's say, a cheap budget option at the forward position. And what is the use case of someone like Carlton Morris at 5.5? I think based on looking at people's drafts so far, if you're actually going for a two-medium template, let's say going for, let's say, Salah and Haaland, or maybe Kane and Haaland, you could and you should probably go for a 5.5 forward or a 5.0 forward to try and fill in the gaps for your team. Someone who actually you would know would be starting every single game. Why is that interesting? Because if you, let's say, go for a 4-5-1 draft or a 4-4-2 draft, these are the structures where you probably need to have, let's say, a third player on the bench, because I think in 4-4-2 drafts so far that I've seen with Salah, you can't really afford Jesus and Kunku. So you might be actually looking at, let's say, the rotational pair that I talked about in terms of DCL and also Morris. At the same time, you could also go for a 4-5-1 draft where you would be looking at maybe going for Morris just simply as your bench player. And even though you're spending additional 1.0 for that, you have to do that because unfortunately, if let's say Erling Haaland is injured, the 4-5-1 formation becomes illegal because your auto sub would have to be a forward. Therefore, any of your other auto subs would not be able to play. So you would need to call upon a forward. And based on Balogun not moving so far and some of the other 4.5 options not being so appealing, then as you can see, going for someone who actually plays every single match as a forward on your bench would be necessary if you go for a 4-5-1 template. If we now move on to, let's say, Adebayo, who I talked about briefly, at 5.0, I think he's more fitting towards this category where, as I said, if you're going for a very risky or maybe slightly different 4-5-1 draft, you would need to call upon a striker who actually plays every game for 90 minutes, and he's going to be that guy for you. As far as, let's say, NDIA from Sheffield United, hey guys, it's Fran from the future here, and actually at the time of the ending of this recording, I just saw a Fabrizio Romano tweet that NDIA is actually going to be set to leave Sheffield United. So if you're watching the video at the segment of where I first mentioned NDIA and you're thinking it's quite weird, yeah, I mean, he's not an option anymore at FPL, so do continue watching. As far as the midfielders right now, if we just move quickly on towards that position, I do think that there's only two options that really strike my mind at this point in time. That's going to be Zaroury at 5.0 for Burnley, and this is only in the situation where I think if you're going for a 3-4-3 draft, because right now the 4.5 midfielders aren't a particularly strong position in terms of, let's say, having someone as appealing as Andreas in the year past. What I would say is at 5.0, maybe you'd be able to stretch that budget to get a 0.5 spent on a player like Zaroury, who would actually be playing most of the games and actually have interesting stats, right? So someone who you could actually get good auto sub points from. He had less expected goals compared to most of the elite midfielders in the game, even comparing to, let's say, some of the 6.5 midfielders. That's a bit of a drop off from players like March, Mbumo, and Mitoma. So that's a bit of a problem point there. But the expected assist numbers are actually very, very consistent. So him being close to players like March, being close to players like Mitoma is a very positive sign if you're just looking to spend at 5.0 for someone who's exclusively going to fill out your bench. Then at 5.5, of course, you've got Benson, who was actually revealed on day one of the price reveals. He actually has really good stats, actually very comparable at this point in time to a Mitoma compared to a March as well. Unfortunately, with these stats and also with the expectation that Burnley are going to really struggle because the fixtures are so poor for them, I don't think right now I would really be going for Benson in my draft. We now move on to the defenders. I think there's actually a lot of context that I would like to set out and some interesting research that I'd like to share as well. So what the first chart is showing is the performance of the promoted teams within the last 3 seasons of the championship. As you can clearly see, Brentford and Burnley are the 2 teams that I've singled out as very elite defenses in the championship at least. And you can also see that Brentford, also if you've just been watching football, really, that Brentford have translated that defense incredibly well. As far as Burnley, this is an early positive sign because the fact that they actually had less XGC than Brentford is really nice. You can see that all these championship promoted teams in white and red highlighted have actually struggled and they've put up XGC numbers that are much worse. You can see, for example, Nottingham Forest in 21-22 with 54.5. I put an asterisk there because, of course, Nottingham Forest ended up spending a ton before the Premier League season started in 22-23. So I feel like that definitely changed the defensive quality of the team. They got some interesting new players on the team and also got Keylor Navas mid-season as well. Norwich, of course, you can see that they struggled immediately in the Premier League. And, of course, this is one thing to say as well, that goals conceded isn't a very good illustration of how good your defense is because in one year you can overperform, in one year you can underperform. And I think a good sort of suggestion of how that looks like is Brentford actually underperformed in the year that they actually promoted from that 2021 season. And then actually they once again underperformed the next year in 21-22. But this year they pretty much played close to level of what they did. They sort of overperformed in terms of a GC compared to expected goals conceded point of view. But for that reason, I do think it's worth actually looking at teams that have shown that their XGC is very low, and that would translate hopefully very well to the Premier League. Because as you can see, teams like Fulham and Bournemouth last year, who were still pretty competitive defenses when you compare to some of these red outliers in years past, they still immediately struggled in the Premier League. And I think that's the default expectation for promoted teams coming from the Championship. So for that reason, Fulham, Bournemouth, and Nottingham Forest, they actually ended up occupying spots 16, 17, and 18th in terms of expected goals conceded. Fulham slightly overperforming their expectations as well by conceding much less, around 10 goals less than you'd expect. So that's an interesting sign. And then, of course, in 21-22, we had teams like Watford and Norwich, of course, who just immediately struggled, mostly because the defense was so poor. But then I've also shown Leeds, a 2021 promoted team, that also really struggled. And that's sort of the expectations you have for Championship teams. So if we actually look at some of the options for the defenders now, I think if we start with Bayer at 4.0, he's someone that I would just avoid because the Burnley fixtures are so bad. And I'm sure some people will still invest money into going for Bayer, but because the fixtures are poor, he's probably prone and subject to a price decrease. And Burnley are probably going to start the season poorly just because that particular run of the season is poor, and you'd expect them to actually pick up points later on in the year. As far as other defenders, right, from other teams, I do think Sheffield United is the most interesting team to talk about, because we illustrated that sort of early fixture run and the greatness of potentially going for a 4.5 Sheffield United defender. And Sheffield United actually do have a perfect 4.5 defender to look at, and that's going to be Anel Ahmedhodzic. And what's so great about him is he has exquisite expected goals per 90 numbers, and then really good expected assists per 90 for a center back. Actually, absurdly high expected assists per 90, because if you actually looked at my cheat sheet, none of the center backs really have high expected assists at all. 0.08 is something that I would actually say is actually comfortably good, because that's already better than, let's say, a fullback like a Rico Henry coming from this Brentford team. And then, of course, Anel's sort of heading statistics and his XG per 90, it pretty much puts him alongside the class of someone like Gabriel, who is one of the better headers of the ball, and clearly someone that this Arsenal team targeted. And Arsenal were one of the leading set piece teams last season, so it's actually a huge surprise to see how great Anel's numbers are. And at 4.5, if you wanted to start the season with him and then easily pivot towards Botman at game week 5, I wouldn't complain. I think that would actually be quite an interesting differential strategy, and for that reason, I do think it's actually worth considering actually spending a little bit more money for Anel over his peer at 4.0, which is going to be Baldock. Baldock's nice because he actually is a fullback, right? So you're going to expect much better expected assists per 90. And compared to some of the other options at 4.0, I think he actually has genuine XGI. There is a bit of a drop off, of course, compared to someone like Anel, but Baldock is someone who, if let's say Sheffield United don't actually bring in anyone else to compete in that position with him, could be a more than serviceable early option at 4.0, particularly because Sheffield United's games are good. And at game week 1, I think that crucial coverage of maybe, let's say, if you go for a Chelsea player like a Reece James, maybe you could actually play him in game week 1 if you'd like to. But I might still not advise that to be the case. I think you'd rather just have a 4.0 player come on as an auto sub where necessary. The last option is going to be Bell from Luton Town, and unfortunately, he is the option that is least appealing, but I think could also be appealing if you go and opt for that sort of Everton rotation. So if Branthwaite, who I mentioned, or if you plan to go for any other 4.5 defender like a Tarkowski from Everton, if you do plan to go for some sort of fixture pairing like that, and you target the really easy fixtures that Everton and Luton Town share between them up until game week 8 or 9, then you could actually benefit from maybe going for Bell in your team. And for that reason, I do think he becomes quite an interesting opportunity. But as you can clearly see, with the expected goals and the expected 90, not exactly particularly good. And he might even miss game week 1 because he's, of course, returning back from the Gold Cup, which he's participating in right now in international competition. But that's going to be it for the promotion watch list video. I hope you guys had a wonderful time, and I will see you guys in the next video. Let me know what your thoughts are. Have I missed out on any kind of championship players? Are you looking at sort of disregarding them altogether? What 4.0 defender is your priority option? Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.